I repeat what I said before, who's using whom? Flávio Bolsonaro is being used by Marco Rubio, not the other way around. This gesture, this kind of signal, this kind of boost to Flávio Bolsonaro's candidacy given by the Secretary of State is his own candidacy for Trump's succession. Flávio Bolsonaro represents a kind of wedge, a kind of entry into Brazilian political reality with the signature. Marco Rubio, it's not about winning. So we have to look at this from that perspective first, right? Why? Now we're going to look at the risks and characteristics of this attitude. We've seen the reasons. Now let's look at the risks, right? The risk is obvious, right? We have a position, this position of classifying any action as narco-terrorism. It's the excuse, quote unquote, for violating international law. Maduro was kidnapped, in quotes as well. Maduro was handed over, but officially he was arrested because he belonged, due to an accusation back in 2004, he belonged to a group, narco-terrorists, which doesn't exist, but it doesn't matter. It was a fabrication.
It's the Cartel of Los Soles, isn't that it?
Exactly, the Cartel of Los Soles, which doesn't exist. It was a creation of the Venezuelan press for the kind of political protection that the traffickers had, the Cartel of the Sun. So when you were there, ruling there, it's impressive, isn't it? The authorization for the capture was delivered, but let's call it a capture if you want, if we want. The capture order for Maduro was exactly this accusation. In other words, this can happen in other territories as well. The United States is authorizing itself to invade countries and acting like some kind of intercontinental sheriff to capture people. This is so real, this is absolutely real, that President Lula, as soon as he returned, as soon as the situation in Venezuela happened, realized the risk. He called the Brazilian military, the army commander, the navy commander, the commander, whoever you want, just Google it, search, and you'll find it. What Lula said very clearly, if it happened there, it can happen here. Now we have, let's call it this way, the typically American institutional protocol in defiance of international law for this to happen. So when we look at this, we have to consider the damage to Brazilian sovereignty. Crimes committed by Brazilians. This has nothing to do with protecting the PCC or the Red Command or drug trafficking organizations. They are dangerous, they are a very big risk, they should be fought by Brazilian laws, by Brazilian authorities for crimes committed here in Brazil. So this does not authorize anyone from any spectrum to do this. Drugs are an international problem. Any European country is infested with drugs. Anywhere outside Eastern Europe has drugs. There are drugs in China. Fentanyl enters the United States coming from China. This is not a Brazilian problem. The regulation of this process already exists through international laws, and they are effective. By the way, President Lula, together with President Trump, our foreign minister Mauro Vieira, and others, the director of the federal police himself said he was present. He said that Brazil had made progress in forms of cooperation, in cooperation programs with U.S. law enforcement, with the American justice system, to punish any kind of action by these narco, these terror, these drug traffickers, right? That's the essential point. This had already been agreed upon, respecting international procedures. What Marco Rubio did was put Brazil on the same level as other smaller countries that he can invade and go after. You'll probably ask, is this very unlikely? Yes, it is. It's much more likely that punishments like sanctions might happen, sanctions on people, sanctions on companies. A similar decision was already made with Mexico about 6 months ago. Nothing happened. It was just political. This decision by Marco Rubio, for him to have the courage to do this, to have Trump's ear, because in the other ear there's Scott Bassett telling him, look, Brazil is serious. Trump himself, his opinion about who President Lula is that he's a dynamic guy. Remember that? Everyone took note. ICL did a fantastic article about it. So everything was more or less settled, right, in what Trump heard. This warning from Marco Rubio, this breather that Marco Rubio offers to the Bolsonaro clan, it carries a threat. Forgive my boldness, poor Cuba. That's a bad sign. If he dared to do this against his boss's wishes, against Trump, who was more relaxed with Brazil, he might dare to take other actions regarding Cuba, because he really wants that. If Marco Rubio manages to bring about a change in the Cuban regime, even if it's not a change but a military invasion of Cuba, his chances as a candidate are very high. We need to discuss this. That's another angle. Why does he do this to appeal to Hispanic voters? It's a different reality. There's a third point, right? We've seen the reasons, we've seen the risks. Let's look at the third point. It's effective. It's real. Will it actually have an effect on the candidacy of A, B, or C here in Brazil? Be careful. I've already mentioned this here to you as well. I'll just repeat what I've already said. I would like any Brazilian military officer of any political persuasion, A, B, or C, to be called and ask a Brazilian general, brigadier, or admiral if he agrees with any risk to Brazilian sovereignty. Not even a scratch. Ask him. No military officer of any stripe would accept something like that. It's obvious that they wouldn't. It's also obvious that the Brazilian voter, when they understand what this is about, what this means, will feel the same way. That Brazilians could end up being arrested, mistreated, or killed on boats, as has already happened to dozens in the Caribbean Sea. If any of us will accept or agree with that, if it's politically effective, I have my doubts. I usually remind everyone who does this that voting in Brazil, I'll focus on the most recent part, okay? From the democratization period onwards, right? Voting in Brazil is absolutely marked by nationalist positions. Be careful! Everyone who did this lost the election. Brazilians don't want anyone telling them what to do in their own home. No, this is very clear, regardless of educational level or income. That's pretty much unanimous. That's a fact. If anyone likes to remember, think about President Sarney and the issue, for example, of state-owned companies. I'm talking about President Sarney 40 years ago. And from then on...
And I don't even know anymore. It happened with Tari Facio, right, Trevisan? Tari Facio now, Ales.
You took the words right out of my mouth, Cesar. Exactly. Good point. President Lula was facing popularity problems. Then came the Tari Facio, and he took a defensive stance for Brazil and said, not here. It went up, it went up. That's well known. All the polls recorded it. So therefore, I have a certain suspicion that all this celebration that both Flávio and his brother Eduardo have already done, and everything else could mean shooting themselves in the foot. Because the Brazilian voters' behavior is marked by strong nationalism. This isn't just about this election, and even less about any political leaning, whether right or left. No, you don't do that, because the Brazilian voter, there's more to it. I'm in charge. I remember when the Colombia plan was in place and the actions of the Colombia plan to deploy Colombian soldiers who were trying to arrest Pablo Escobar, that whole situation. There was brutal resistance from Latin America, led by Brazil, against the American army setting up a base there in Colombia. No one accepted it. More recently, I'll give you a concrete example of what I'm talking about, of how much this is shooting yourself in the foot with names and surnames. More recently, there was an intention from a comrade named Mike Pompeo, who was the American Secretary of State at the time. That must have been, I'm speaking from memory, maybe around 2020. Just check Google. When I mention it, you'll remember. Just check Google. Or were the United States planning a collective Latin American operation led by American troops to fight drug trafficking on the borders of Colombia, Bolivia, and Brazil, and that it would be important for them to be there in Colombia to face it as well? The Brazilian representative at this meeting was Vice President Hamilton Mourão, who brought the Brazilian Armed Forces' traditional position. We have no interest in this. We are not going to do it. We don't have that. The intention was, what was in the subtext of this was to form a force of right-wing groups to attack the Venezuelan government. I remember perfectly that Mourão asked the question, are our tanks older? Are the Venezuelan tanks more modern? Do you remember? Are you going to bring your tanks here? We don't want that. Just, look, I'm talking about Hamilton Mourão, Bolsonaro's government. He didn't mess around with Brazilian nationalism. So therefore, I think we have these three aspects to look at in this situation. There's the aspect of the motives, which are not in Bolsonaro's candidacy. They're not being used. The risk factor, which poses a very high risk to sovereignty, and the efficiency aspect, which is highly questionable.
Another perspective. And then we saw, for example, over the last few decades, the United States use some, let's say, approaches, right, and discursive strategies. Mainly considering the fight against terror after September 11, the fight against drugs, the fight against corruption with the FCPA and so on. And they're really good at this sort of Hollywood-style thing of exploring themes that are, to some extent, irrefutable. Because, common sense will never say, well, I think it's bad that you fight organized crime, fight drugs, or fight corruption. No one is going to take that stance. But then we know, for example, there's the book. We've already talked about it here. I've already discussed it with you here on the channel. The book, for example, The American Trap, which shows how the FCPA was basically used to kidnap the Alstom executive, the French executive from Alstom, from the top of Alstom's board, to force Patrick Crone, who was the company's president at the time, to sell Alstom's boiler division to General Electric, which is a giant of American capitalism. And this served General Electric's interests and also helped destabilize France's own nuclear program. So we know that measures like this, announced today by Marco Rubio, can have some level of practical implication. I don't think the United States will invade Brazil to kidnap Lula, because that would be the biggest scandal maybe in modern history, let's put it that way. But
it wouldn't have the same efficiency as the circus setup in Caracas. It's a completely different reality.
So let's get to it. I wanted you to explore this a bit more because I also believe that's very unlikely. But I think this could have a sense of coercion, of blackmail, of this more direct interference in our domestic affairs, which is already materialized. Now, it's no longer just a question of if and when it will happen. Now, we already have factual evidence that points to a very direct interference in our domestic affairs, looking at the election, right?
This point is essential. Because thinking that the Americans are going to come here to kidnap some PCC gang leader in the Amazon is kind of a joke, right? That's not going to happen, right? Brazilian territory is, do we have shortcomings? Yes, we do. But it's well enough defended to prevent adventures like that, right? It's not quite like that yet. But I want to highlight another detail. This is the step where you label these entities, these factions, as narco-terrorists. They authorize that any sector accused by the American justice system can be punished with sanctions. That's the point. We could use, for example, let's think of a hypothetical crazy situation, oil on the equatorial margin. The United States is interested in this and wants to buy it, and I have a sector of the PCC that's friends with so-and-so. So I'm going to impose a sanction against this company until I'm just explaining. I'm not saying that's how it is. It's just a didactic example. The sanction can happen in many different ways. The biggest danger of this is not military action in a country like Brazil with 210 million inhabitants. That's not it. Brazil is not Venezuela, with all its internal divisions and everything else. When people think of Venezuela, please, before thinking about Maduro, about being captured, what do they think of? In April of last year, not this year, Delcy Rodriguez stayed. She stayed for more than a month in Washington, negotiating all the agreements. If anyone has any doubts about that, please check the Financial Times, which published a fantastic article about Delcy Rodriguez, During Trump's 2024 campaign, the head of a Venezuelan oil subsidiary made a donation to Trump's campaign. Pay attention to that. So, when you talk about this, if anyone has any doubts, just check the Financial Times. Yeah, the source isn't mine, nor is it any questionable source, right? It's a newspaper like that, like the Financial Times, showing that she had ties with Trump from before. That's why it happened there.